Hi, for those who don't know me, my name's Helen Dickinson. As Mike said, I'm the Deputy Director at Treasury with responsibility for energy and transport taxation, including taxation of the UKCS. I know it's not good to start with an apology, but I'm afraid I'm going to. I've got a bit of a cold which has gone to my voice. I suspect I'm going to get more and more hoarse through these 20 minutes, and there might at some point be a bit of a coughing fit. So apologies in advance if I become harder and harder to hear. So what I was hoping to do this morning was set out a little bit from the government's perspective what this kind of decommissioning certainty project was about, why the government saw this as important, what we wanted to achieve from it, and hopefully hence give some context to kind of Peter's presentation where he's going to give the sort of industry perspective on the decommissioning relief deed. So to go kind of back to basics, what is government trying to achieve at all with taxation of the UK continental shelf and our oil and gas resources? In effect, we use the tax regime as a way of getting a return for the nation from exploitation of the UK's oil and gas resources. But at the same time, we're very aware that the people who are actually exploiting these oil and gas resources, it's not the government, it's private investment, private companies, private capital. So with the tax system, we need to balance getting a return for the nation from the exploitation of those resources, but also ensuring that the tax regime is incentivizing investors to come in and get those resources out of the ground in order that we can realize the benefits. So what we're trying to do with the UKCS fiscal regime as a whole is get that balance between incentivizing investment for the long term and also getting a return for the exchequer from that. And we've seen that through a lot of the policy developments over the past year and a half have been sort of focusing in this area with the introduction of new field allowances, such as the brownfield allowance, to enable exploitation of more challenging resources in the North Sea. So, realizing that in some cases we need to adjust the tax regime to achieve those objectives. And this decommissioning certainty work fits very much in that context. So why is the decommissioning certainty important? I'm sort of assuming that most of you here know the basics of the UKCS tax regime and the fact that there is tax relief for the future decommissioning costs at sort of 50% for most fields and 75% for older fields paying petroleum revenue tax or PRT. I'm also guessing that as an audience you're pretty familiar with the fact that the future decommissioning costs for the North Sea are expected to be very significant. I think the latest estimate I've seen is of the order of £35 billion, of which we'd expect of the order of 20 billion to end up falling to the exchequer in the form of tax relief on those costs. So while I would love to think that everybody always trusts government, but I'm aware that this isn't always the case. And there's kind of some concern in the industry that although at the moment we give this tax relief on decommissioning expenditure, how can the industry be sure that in 20 or 30 years' time, when it comes to government actually starting to pay out on that tax relief, that a future government wouldn't change the tax regime so that there was no longer any tax relief? And if any of you are fiscal fanatics, fiscal geeks, and read the Office of Budget Responsibility's long-term fiscal sustainability forecasts for the UK, you'll find a nice little graph of long-term oil and gas tax receipts, which at some point starts going negative, which is the point where government's payments in decommissioning relief start outweighing the money we get in tax. And understandably, I think there was a concern from the industry that we couldn't be sure that a future government would definitely honour the current system for decommissioning relief, which leads to kind of current issues in the North Sea. So what we were sort of concerned about in this whole project on decommissioning certainty was the impacts up there on the left of the lack of certainty about a future government's approach to decommissioning costs, that particularly the need to tie up security for future decommissioning on a pre-tax basis was making it more difficult to get asset trades in the basin. And we're very aware that as the North Sea is a maturing basin, asset trades are an important part of that, ensuring that to get the maximum economic recovery, we're seeing the companies that are best placed to manage assets at particular times in their life able to manage those assets. So not having certainty over future decommissioning relief costs was sort of creating a barrier to asset trades. And what we'd hope to achieve through providing certainty is to simplify the process of asset trades and hence sort of maximise the efficiency of the North Sea as a whole. Also, just very, very basic but very important point, not having certainty on the tax relief on decommissioning meant that companies felt obliged to post security for future decommissioning costs on a pre-tax basis, so assuming that there would be no tax relief available from government. And clearly that's tying up quite a lot of capital when your total costs of decommissioning over the long term are of the order of, as I said earlier, £32 billion. So by providing certainty on future decommissioning tax relief, we would hope to free up capital for new investment and also enable those making decisions on financing of projects in the North Sea to take account of that lower capital requirement. And I think OG UK at the start of this project sort of commissioned some work to look at how much capital could be freed up if there was certainty on decommissioning tax relief availability. And I think it was something of the order of £17 billion of investment could be freed up by this process. Now, we know as government that we're not necessarily going to put all the capital freed up back into the North Sea, but we hope a pretty big chunk of that would go back into the UK, into the North Sea, hence sort of bringing benefits from government's perspective as well as for businesses. Our sort of last concern on sort of the impacts of the lack of certainty about future availability of decommissioning tax relief was simply that this could provide an incentive for premature decommissioning. If companies thought, well, if we decommission it now, we know we can get the relief, but with a marginal field, it's quite a finely balanced decision whether we go on producing, and if we're not certain that that tax relief will be available in a few years' time, then we might choose to cease production early. So again, what we're hoping to achieve through this project by providing greater certainty on future availability of the tax relief on decommissioning was to prevent that incentive for early decommissioning, and again, in the long term, maximise the recovery from the North Sea. So this is what we're aiming to achieve. How we went about it? Well, this is where you get a nice picture of my boss, which I think is budget 12. If you look at the personnel, you can kind of work out who is on the front bench at which budget. So at budget 2012, the Chancellor announced that the government would enter into a contractual approach to providing certainty on the availability of decommissioning tax relief in the North Sea. So in effect, that government would enter into some kind of contract with the industry saying, here is how much tax relief you can get, which would be, in effect, a contract for difference on the future tax code. There then followed, there's an awful lot hidden in that step between budget 2012 and budget 2013. We had a kind of very extensive process of consultation with the industry, sort of very intensive, very collaborative process of working out how we could make a reality of this contract. And I think it was, I think it's an achievement that all those involved should be proud of. There was some kind of very difficult issues we had to work through. In government policy making terms, it's very innovative to do something like this, to provide a contract about what the future tax code is going to look at, or in effect to bind government's hands about future tax decisions. And I think working through all those issues in time for Budget 13 to be able to announce that those first contracts would be signed by the end of the year was a real kind of tribute to a lot of very effective joint working between a lot of people from the industry, from OG UK, and also in government and HMRC. Then last September at the Offshore Europe conference in Aberdeen, the Chancellor announced that we had a final deed ready to be entered into. And the first deeds were signed and delivered to companies in October of this year. And we are still giving out deeds on a regular basis. So moving on to what this deed actually does, I described it very briefly as a sort of contract for difference on the future tax code. Up at the top there, this sort of briefly explains what the current tax treatment for decommissioning relief is. The aim of the deed is in effect to crystallise the relief available as at Royal Assent of Finance Bill 2013, hence providing a very strong incentive for government not to change the tax treatment for decommissioning relief from what it was as at Royal Assent to Finance Bill 2013, since this deed will mean that if we do so in a way that is not favourable to the industry, government will need to pay out under the deed the difference between the amount in the new tax system and the amount that would have been available for companies as at royal assent of this year's finance bill. So in effect, what this deed does, and we have a single deed, the same deed, which is available to all kind of companies operating or associated with companies operating in the UKCS. So the deed defines what decommissioning expenditure is, using the definitions in the tax code again. It establishes an amount which the company can expect to receive in decommissioning tax relief, which is known as the reference amount in the deed. And if this level of relief is not achieved through the tax code at the time a company comes to make a claim, then they will be able to access a difference payment through the deed. Now, the deed itself is, inevitably a reasonably hefty document with an awful lot of detail on what would happen in kind of different variations of particular future circumstances. But I think the key point to take home is if this works as it should, nobody should ever need to claim under the deed, because myself and my successors in my role will always have an enormous incentive not to change the tax regime for decommissioning relief, because there would be no exchequer benefit to government from doing so, because if they do, exactly the same payments would need to be paid out under the deed. I'll just give, excuse me a moment. One last point. As a result of that, the fact that the deed, in effect, is there to sort of crystallise the tax relief available for decommissioning as at Royal Assent of Finance Act 2013. From the government's perspective, we don't expect having this deed to increase the forecast cost to the exchequer of decommissioning. So we're already expecting that government will need to pay out in the order of £20 billion, assuming there's no further cost increases, at least £20 billion in decommissioning tax relief. But this deed doesn't increase that amount. It gives more certainty on that amount, but it's not increasing liabilities to government. So from a policy perspective, one of the great attractions of this policy for government is it's a way of increasing investment in the UKCS by providing certainty, but it doesn't actually cost the government anything. So it's the magic policy in that sense. I would love it if there were more policies that worked like this one, to have such a practical effect on investment without actually impacting directly on the exchequer. So, excuse me. How does this reference amount work? Well, there's a distinction made in the deed between two situations. The situation when a company is in effect paying for its own decommissioning, the decommissioning it was expecting to have to do, and the situation where a company has become liable for another company's decommissioning because that company has defaulted. So, for example, Company A sells its field to Company B. Company B, end-of-life specialist, supposed to be the one doing the decommissioning. Something goes wrong, Company B defaults, goes bankrupt, and under the Petroleum Act, debt come after Company A saying, well, actually, you need to pick up these decommissioning costs now. So we made a distinction in the deed between those two scenarios. So in the scenario in which a company is meeting another party's decommissioning costs, this was key to ensuring that the deed enabled a move to post-tax security. So here, the deed provides a very significant amount of certainty. That the deed guarantees that the person picking up the decommissioning will receive tax relief at 30% in respect of RFCT and at 20% in respect of SC. And that in the case of PRT fields, companies will receive at least the same level of relief in respect of PRT that the defaulting party would have received, or greater if using their own tax history gives them a greater level of relief. Where a deed holder is picking up their own decommissioning, the deed basically ensures that the level of relief is aligned with the tax paid, which is what you'd expect under the current tax code. And another quite important point on this, the deed also ensures that if a future government were to abolish petroleum revenue tax, the kind of relief, decommissioning relief in respect of petroleum revenue tax would still be available. And the definitions used are all, as I said, as at Finance Act 2013. Now, eligibility for the deed. Basically, we'd like the deed to be available to anybody who thinks that they may be in a situation of needing to pick up their own or another company's decommissioning costs, which in effect means that government will enter into a deed with any company that has at any time carried on a ring-fence trade or been associated with a company carrying on a ring-fence trade. And there is an additional clause for cross-boundary fields, which I will let you read yourselves. We're expecting about 350 companies to be eligible under this definition, and so far we have signed, I think, 49 deeds. So there's a lot of people out there who don't yet have a deed, who might benefit from one, from whom we're waiting to hear. So what's the process if your company actually wants to have a deed? Well, there's guidance on the lovely gov.uk website. I haven't put in the ridiculously long URL, but if you tap decommissioning relief deed application process into Google, it does come up as the first hit. In effect, a company wanting to apply for a deed will need to demonstrate to the government that it is carrying on a ring-fence trade or is associated with a company that is carrying on a ring-fence trade, and would also need to demonstrate it's the ability of those who are going to execute the deed on behalf of the company to enter into that commitment on behalf of the company. So we will receive that application. We will check that this company has indeed been carrying out a ring-fence trade or associated with a company carrying out a ring-fence trade. And then we will issue a deed signed by the Lords Commissioners to the Treasury. We're aiming to turn deed applications around within 3 weeks. I think we've managed about that so far. Occasionally during parliamentary recess it becomes more challenging because we may need to sort of run around the country looking for the Lords Commissioners if they're not in London. But you know, if anybody is applying for a deed and has a particular deadline that they need a deed because they've got all they're about to move to post-tax security and they need it for a particular date, do tell us. I think so far we've always managed to provide deeds to companies when they needed them. There's then a stage of applying to HMRC for a certificate in respect of petroleum revenue tax in order that you can know the tax history associated with the particular fields for which you may have responsibility for decommissioning. So say we're hoping that we'll never need to get to the bottom point of making a claim under the deed, but if you did feel that we government had changed the tax code in such a way that you're no longer getting the relief that you expected, the deed claim would come in to Treasury. We, together with HMRC, would examine that claim, see whether we kind of agreed that the deed meant that a claim was valid, and the payment would then come from Treasury. So in terms of implementation, as I said, we've signed 49 DRDs so far. We're expecting that there's a big bunch still to come. We know that these have already enabled some companies for some decommissioning security arrangements to move from pre-tax to post-tax arrangements, which ultimately is the aim of this project. So that's fantastic to hear. We're required to do a report to Parliament on progress on all this quite soon. So it's going to be quite important to us that we can demonstrate to Parliament that this innovative approach is having the effect that it's meant to have. In other words, that the deed is enabling a move from pre-tax to post-tax security. And also, I think our ministers are keen to hear a further update from the industry as a whole on the extent of move from pre to post-tax security at the Fiscal Forum, which the Exchequer Secretary will be chairing this autumn, which I think reflects that ultimately the success of this policy in achieving the aims that we've set out for it does depend on the deed enabling that move from pre to post-tax security. And that's, we thought during this policy, would it be possible to require a move to post-tax security? We concluded that we couldn't. There's always going to be kind of commercial arrangements that companies themselves need to make the decisions on. But we would be, if the deed doesn't enable a move from pre to post-tax security, then something has gone wrong with this policy. So we're hoping that we're going to get more and more news of more and more DSAs moving from pre and post-tax and freeing up capital for further investment in the North Sea. And I think that's me pretty much exactly on my 20 minutes. So thank you very much. I think there'll be an opportunity for questions after the break. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed.